Dude, we are going to energise the country.
Stop Brexit.
No more Mr. Nice Guy.
Another future's possible, but we've got to fight for it.
Order!
Hello and welcome to the Debated podcast. As always, I'm your host Will, and I'm joined by my co-host Conrad.
Hello.
And in this episode, we are delighted to be joined by Chris Newton, who is a military historian and a former defence advisor to the Conservative Party. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
So the first question that I'd like to ask is, obviously, with everything that's been happening with the pandemic recently, defence hasn't been on the top of the political agenda as such, but of course it's still an important issue. Are there any particular issues around defence that you think are happening at the moment that we should be discussing more or are pertinent to the current pandemic?
I think, I mean, there are lots of kind of issues spanning from the pandemic because a lot of this is interlinked. So, for example, this, the whole reason why the disease, the coronavirus has got out of control is really because obviously you had the wet markets in China, and of course that got out of control, and then China, wasn't exactly 100% transparent about what was happening, and so forth. So there is a major security issue here in terms of authoritarian powers allowing sort of practices, dodgy practices. Practices that we would like to stamp out, and the key issue here is how do we persuade, coerce, deter authoritarian powers from not being as transparent as we would like them to be. So there's that issue. Another issue spanning from it is the fact that we are. We have in the past kind of had this belief that we could separate trade from geopolitics, and that we could trade with China and trade with authoritarian powers, and we can kind of put them in different boxes, and issues concerning human rights and transparency and things like that. That we can kind of separate themselves, separate them out, and we can trade as normal, and therefore and have have this kind of geopolitical situation, tension with powers like China and Russia, that we could essentially have those two running separately, and the fact of the matter is that these are interlinked, and allowing authoritarian states to act with impunity has got us to the situation where we are at the moment. And there are other issues as well, as the role of the armed forces in supporting the various agencies during the course of this pandemic. So the armed forces constructed the Nightingale Hospital in London. It's been helping out with logistics. It's also doing other things such as working with our allies, providing an aviation task force, and having people on standby to help. So the armed forces has played an extremely important role during this crisis, and I think we need to appreciate that more and to understand the role in which the armed forces are playing in this crisis.
Now, you mentioned authoritarian governments like Russia and China and the threat they sort of pose to the UK. One sort of major way, increasingly these countries are acting is in cyber, in that they are using, and cybersecurity is more and more sort of important. Do you think that the UK cybersecurity apparatus is sufficient as it is, or do you think that this is something which needs sort of reform or change, improvement?
I mean, it's been developing over the past few years, but it is an area in which we need to develop more, because we're noticing that the threat from cyber attacks are increasing. But this is something that the government is very much aware of. It's developed the cyber strategy, and it is one of the areas of what's known as hybrid warfare, in which states adversaries are using kind of non-kinetic means of trying to disrupt elements of our society and their enemies' society. So, I mean, I've just been reading David Kilcullen's new book, The Dragons and the Snakes, and one of the things that he argues for the West in general is that we need to understand that these powers are engaging in hybrid warfare effectively, and we need to develop our own responses to that, and to develop our own capabilities in order to deal with that much more. So yes, cyber is an absolutely important element, and it's not. And one of the things I would say is that it's not. It's a lot of people are kind of framing this as we should focus on cyber and information warfare and psychological warfare and so forth. That's the area in which we should focus on, instead of developing conventional capabilities. Conventional warfare or kinetic warfare is a receding concern, and my argument is that both are important, because yes, our adversaries are majoring on the cyber front and on the hybrid front, but they're also developing conventional capabilities as well, in terms of heavy artillery, missiles, anti-ship missiles in the case of China, and also Russia's very much interested in tactical nuclear war as well. So we need to be concerned about all of these things.
Now, you mentioned earlier about global trade, Britain obviously dealing with regimes like China and Russia, and the consensus for the last couple of decades has been an attempt to welcome nations like China and Russia into the economic community, and to not be as adversarial to them. Do you think that it would be better to return to a more adversarial, or perhaps at least a more boundary time in relation to regimes like China and Russia? I think it would be a good thing if we truly understood what we're dealing with, as opposed to dealing with the threat that we actually face, as opposed to hoping for the best, which is what I think our approach has been for the past 10 to 20 years, and is not necessarily being absolutely hostile 100% of the time, but it is a case of understanding that these powers have their interests. They have different ideologies to us. And there is an ideological dimension to this competition that's going on, and again we kind of, and scholars have tended to downplay the ideological element,
And there is an aspect of democracy against authoritarianism here, and also different ways of there are different understandings of how the world should be structured as well. So, for example, Russia believes in spheres of influence, and that they believe that they're entitled to effectively influence the Orthodox Christian world. Whereas we, of course, believe in self-determination, and therefore there are competing interests, but also competing values. And indeed, what Tony Blair said about, there's an ideological component of interests. They got a lot of things wrong, but I think on that aspect, he was right on that. And I think we need to be aware of that, and be aware that the Russia and China in particular, they have a broader conception of what war is. Right, so we have a very narrow conception of what war is, which centres on the use of violent physical force to pursue our objectives. Whereas if you look at, for example, a paper that was written by in China in 1999, they had a conception of war which is not just the use of force, but the use of military and non-military means to compel the enemy to do their will. And we should be wary, and we should be aware of that, and therefore, we need to be on guard for that, and therefore, obviously, we don't. We don't want to trigger the security dilemma. We don't want to necessarily, provoke a war or anything. But we should take a harder stance than we are, and understand that, that they have their interests, they have their values, and they're seeking to undermine our interests and our values.
Now, talking about this different authoritarian regimes and sort of understanding they're sort of got their own interests. Now, one authoritarian regime that's been in the news recently is Saudi Arabia. Is currently going through a takeover of Newcastle United by the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund. As a Newcastle fan, I may be biased on this, but what do you think about Britain's relationship with Saudi Arabia, and in terms of security? And do you think we are too close, or do you think there's a lot of benefit in that relationship?
I mean, this is extremely difficult, and it's and foreign policy is not easy. And there has been a strategic benefits of being allies with Saudi Arabia in the sense of, in terms of terrorism, they're also concerned about the Iranian threat as well, and also it would not serve our security by having instability in that region, in that area, in that country. But on the other side, seeking to put this politely, there are aspects that we need to reconcile in terms of their human rights abuses, and also be mindful of the fact of their ideological concerns and export of various Wahhabi ideology as well. So again, I think it is something that, I mean, we've got a defense review or a security review at the moment, which obviously this pandemic is going to disrupt. Our thinking towards authoritarianism is something that needs to be it has to be considered very carefully in the light of this crisis. And also, you've got, historically, you have examples like Chernobyl and so forth. And I don't profess to have a complete answer at the moment. I'm thinking about these issues as well, and Saudi Arabia has always troubled kind of my mind in terms of balancing these different costs and benefits. But I think our relationships in our approach and our thinking towards that has to be reviewed, and we have to look at how do we persuade, can the Saudis, can regimes like Saudi Arabia be persuaded, as well as coercion and deterrence, for other regimes as well. So and which elements of statecraft as well is most appropriate, and for some regimes, some instruments of statecraft are going to be relevant more than others. So some we can apply more diplomatic means, others we may have to employ more coercive means. But no, that's a good question, and that has troubled British policymakers for a long time.
One issue that will definitely make a big difference on sort of the security of the world is the result of the presidential elections coming up later in the year. Now, Joe Biden has said that he thinks NATO will not exist if Trump gets re-elected. What is your view on the direction which Trump or Biden will take sort of NATO and security in general?
This is an interesting one, because both presidents and previous British prime ministers have always been frustrated at various European NATO partners at the fact that the Europeans haven't really been spending as much as we'd like on defence and meeting the 2% of GDP aspiration on defence. And for years, presidents, NATO Secretary Generals have been saying, well, can you please, spend a bit more? And the response from European powers, from European nations, has been largely business as usual. We're going to carry on as usual. Trump comes along and makes some indications that he might not be as supportive if this situation carries on with certain European partners, and there have been some degree of increase in spending, and at the recent summits. That, together with the threat from Russia, it seems to have seems to at the very least woken some of the countries up. Of course, there's a big risk in Trump, doing this, because if he gives the indication that he's not going to honour Article 5, then of course that sends a message to Russia that the Americans might not come to their aid in the case of a Russian attack. But what else do you do? I mean, everything has been tried, and I can understand why Trump has tried the approach that he did, but it's extremely risky. Maybe a different approach was in order, was needed. I think what you said about Biden. I think Trump. I think sometimes what Trump does, I think he exaggerates, what he says and what he does are sometimes, different. I don't think, the relationship between America and European countries, has been has been strained. But I think when push comes to shove, I think Trump does understand, the importance of the alliance, and the various mechanisms within it. But he's looking for a way in which it could, in which things could be fairer, and I think that is reasonable, especially when America's, has, China to worry about as well. So Trump's approach has been risky. I'm uneasy about it, but what other ways are there to get Europeans to spend more on defence? We've tried, all options.
Now, one of the things that I know that you've particularly written about has been the First World War, and of course, recently we've had the centenary, not just of the start of the war, but of the end of the war. Do you think that the military and defence lessons 100 years on from the First World War have been properly learned by governments, and that we can reflect on this period without biases about the way that it was conducted and the reasons that it occurred?
Yeah, I mean the government had this big commemorative program, in which it commemorated certain battles. And at the start of the centenary, the criticism that historians had was that we kind of, and the way in which the battles were being remembered was that we're kind of remembering all of the kind of defeats, all of the battles where things we were struggling and so forth. But there wasn't really anything about the end of the war and the way in which we conducted the war towards its end, and in particular commemorating battles such as the Battle of Amiens, which was in August 1918, which kickstart the 100 Days campaign, which led to Germany's surrender. So at the start, I think we were still looking at the First World War through the prism of popular culture, which was to highlight, and yeah, I mean there are criticisms to be made of how the war was conducted, and to emphasize the losses, which of course were huge. But what historians wanted to see was much more acknowledgement that the First World War represented a challenge, an immense, unprecedented challenge. We were facing mass industrial trench warfare, and that we're not going to learn how to fight this new kind of warfare overnight, and therefore we did have to make mistakes, unfortunately, but we had to undergo a learning curve in that, or a learning process, as I prefer to call it, and other historians as well. And therefore, we need. I believe that there should have been a lot more recognition of that. Now, to be fair on the government, they did do something for Amiens or at least there was some kind of commemorative event for Amiens. I don't know whether it was still on the official program or not, but there was a significant marking of the Battle of Amiens. So from that respect, I think the government did in the end listen to us, and that part of the First World War debate was reflected. But there's still much to communicate about that the academic scholarship of the war, which tends to reflect this learning process paradigm perspective of the war. And we still need to communicate that for popular culture, because still a lot of TV programs still has the old way of looking at the war. It's still based their programming on the old way of looking at the war. So from that perspective, what I would like to see is that kind of greater understanding of the challenges that the generals faced, and that they weren't all stupid. They weren't all kind of butchers and bunglers. They were trying to learn, and yes, they were made mistakes, and yes, there were good generals, and there weren't so good generals as well. But the fact of the matter was that this was a very difficult challenge that needed to be overcome, and the British and the Allies ultimately did it. They ultimately developed their tactics, constantly learn, and that's the key kind of lesson for today. Really, is being mindful of the need for constant adaptation, and the Germans constantly adapted during the course of the war as well. And there was this co-evolution process or revolution process going on between the two sides. So recognizing the challenges and being willing to adapt and changing to circumstances, and being flexible, wars evolve, wars change. During the course of a war, you're facing with different circumstances. You need to be flexible and adaptable in order to deal with that. So that is what I would say is the key lesson, or one of the key lessons that we should be mindful of.
We're coming to the end of the podcast. It's been great speaking to you, Chris. It's been a very interesting discussion. And I'd like to ask you one final question. We've talked about the pandemic somewhat during the podcast. So my final question to you is, when this is all resolved, what one thing that you can't do now are you looking forward to doing when we're allowed to go out and mingle as we did before?
I've got a number, and you've asked for one. I've got a number of things in mind. I'm going to stick with this one. Just being able to travel and explore the country, and explore, even the UK. Not necessarily go abroad. I miss doing that. I miss just heading somewhere and going somewhere. So yeah, I'm just looking forward just to be able to travel and to walk around, and being able to sit on a park bench again. But really just we're kind of taking it for granted, this ability to travel and to take in what we see, and to really explore this great country of ours. Now I'm definitely not going to take it for granted. I'm going to savor every minute of being able to do that when we do get out of this madness.
I think it's a great response, and one that I certainly agree with, and I think a lot of our listeners will as well. Thank you once again for coming on the podcast.
Okay, thanks. Once again, thanks very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Not a problem. If you've enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe to us on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean and YouTube. If you'd like to follow us on Twitter, you can do @DebatedPodcast. You can like us on Facebook @DebatedPodcast. And if you'd like to email us about this podcast or any others that you've heard, you can do at thedebatedpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, I hope you listen to the next one.